Welcome everyone to today's seminar on COVID-19 and elections in Africa. We are delighted today to have two excellent speakers who share with us their experiences resulting from fieldwork research on the subject in different African countries. One is Robert MacDonald from the University of Edinburgh, who has done extensive work on the subject, and he will speak to us after the first speaker, Koffi Sawyer from the Commonwealth Secretariat, who would have introduced the subject, speaking more broadly on the manner in which COVID-19 has shaped and affected the quality of elections in Africa. We are delighted that you can join us. And what we'll have is there's two speakers who present their findings, after which we'll open the discussion to the audience to interact with their presentations and indeed to make our own contributions. So the first speaker is Koffi, and Koffi, I'll now hand over to you to share with us your presentation, after which I'll move to the next presenter, Robert MacDonald. I am your host, Sishua from the Institute for Democracy, Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa, alongside my co-host, Matthias, whom you cannot see, but who has made much of this work possible. So Koffi, over to you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sushiwa. I'm very grateful for the invitation to join this edition of your monthly webinar. Good afternoon, colleagues. And congratulations, on this platform, which I believe it's quite a useful platform when it comes to engaging on issues which are so dear to our continent. The Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy at UCT is doing quite a remarkable job, and thanks for this opportunity. I'll speak today mostly as an international civil servant, a practitioner, rather than an academic. As you're aware, I work for the Commonwealth. I am responsible for the Southern Africa portfolio within the political division. The political division is in the Governance and Peace Directorate, and I'm responsible for political processes in Southern African countries. So elections, political dialogues, and institution building, and so on and so forth. I must first of all indicate that I'm speaking on my own behalf. So my views here are just for us to engage, and they are not necessarily a reflection of the positions of the organization I work for. I think that caveat is quite important. So my presentation is going to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on elections in Africa. So how has COVID-19 shaped or affected the quality of elections in Africa? Obviously, I don't have a silver bullet to this question. Of course, I'll share a number of perspectives which we would further discuss and develop. I don't think there is any silver bullet answer to this issue, especially because COVID-19 is still quite new. The impacts are not they're not particularly known. There is a lot of anecdotal conversations, but the real empirical data on the extent to which it has affected democracy, especially elections on the continent, is the jury is still out on that. So my presentation will be broken down into two parts. The first one is going to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the quality of elections. And then the second part is going to look at the role and perceptions of international election observation in the COVID era. I am trying to share my screen. I don't know if Shishiwa, I'm not sure if you can see my screen, colleagues.
Yes, I can. We can see it says what the data says, so it's very clear.
Yeah, you just have to start your presentation.
Okay. Just a second. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's going to be broken down into two parts. The first part is, as I said, the impact of COVID-19 on elections, and the second part, the role and perception of international election observers. I'll start with defining the basic concepts. So Africa would mean sub-Saharan Africa, because that's the area of focus on elections. I mean, of course, free, fair, competitive, institutionalized processes through which people choose their national leaders. And I must say I would focus on national elections rather than sub-national for ease of my own work. Specifically, I would focus on presidential elections in my analysis. And then electoral quality, of course, is how good an election is. There are so many concepts which are used interchangeably in this to describe this quality which we're talking about. So we have credible elections, we have free and fair elections, we have genuine elections, and electoral integrity. All are going to be used interchangeably in this presentation. And then I'll also, as I said, emphasize on national elections. This does not mean that sub-national elections are not important, because there have been a number of sub-national elections which have also been held within the context of the COVID pandemic. So my main hypothesis here is that COVID-19 has not substantially impacted electoral quality in Africa. We'll see how that plays out. The basic assumptions are that the pandemic might have made pre-existing challenges more complicated, especially pertaining to elections, but Africa's pre-pandemic score for credible elections, especially as shown by the Perceptions of Integrity Index, had been the lowest even before the pandemic. So the challenges to electoral integrity, the challenges to the quality of elections predate COVID-19. So in terms of timelines, the WHO, of course, declared COVID-19 as an international emergency on the 30th of January. On 11 March, the organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. So it's from the 11th of March that it became a global pandemic. The first cases of infection were reported on the continent around mid-February of 2020. So in response to the pandemic, a number of countries postponed their elections, and in most cases, they were parliamentary and other subnational elections. But for the best part, countries went ahead with holding their elections. So what guided that decision to go ahead? I mean, I think there is quite a great deal of variation in terms of what prompted leaders to take the decision whether or not to hold elections in the context of COVID. Obviously, they did make their own political cost-benefit analysis, and these included the fact that some indeed wanted to take advantage, in my view, of the COVID pandemic to win their elections. Others realized that postponing elections could present more complicated challenges for them. They were already dealing with challenges with their economies and social unrest, and so adding another layer, which would mean bringing political tension to bear upon the state at a time when it had to deal with all these other things because of a postponement, would have been quite a hectic cocktail to deal with. For others, postponement was a good option because it would buy them some time. I'll speak globally. I mean, I could make examples, but just bear with me if I don't call names of countries because of issues around the nature of my job. So for some other countries, it was a constitutional imperative. Election day, was cast in stone. So for instance, Zambia, the day when elections are supposed to be held is enshrined in the constitution. So for other countries, especially countries within the ECOWAS sub-regional bloc, there was no other option than to hold elections because according to the protocol relating to the mechanism for conflict prevention, management and resolution, peacekeeping and security, and it's a supplementary protocol, you cannot introduce modifications to the electoral law within 6 months of holding an election. So changes could not be made to accommodate COVID. Obviously, when this was agreed upon in 2021, in 2001, they had not envisaged the exigencies that would come up with a situation like the one in which we are. So for other countries, it was pure, denialism. So you have, countries which we quite know. Burundi was one of them, and then of course Tanzania, where the leaders expressly did not believe that COVID was an issue. So which countries have actually held elections since then? There are quite a number of countries. As I said, I'll focus on national elections. So just based on this, there are at least 26 elections that have been held, 26 national elections that have been held. Among them, there are 15 presidential elections that have been held since 2020. The last of them, of course, being the elections that were held 2 days ago in Cape Verde. So COVID-19, how has it actually affected elections? The reflections on how COVID would affect elections started quite some time back. There are several articles which articulate these challenges which were predicted, and solutions were, of course, recommended on how to address them. But in my view, there are 3 layers. The first layer is that the virus did affect countries. The social, the economic, and political fabric of society was affected. There were lockdowns, there was devastation on economies, livelihoods destroyed, there was unemployment, and things generally became difficult. So that actually affected the environment, because elections, of course, take place within a given environment, a given context. And so that context already had those challenges that were orchestrated by the COVID-19 pandemic, or made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic, because most of these things already existed. As I said, before the pandemic. COVID-19 also affected issues around logistics of election management, through the challenges with supply chains, lockdowns, shutdowns, and transportation of material internationally, the procurement processes, and so on. And then thirdly, COVID-19 affected elections in a way through the introduction of regulations by governments, regulations which were deemed quite strategically introduced to stifle the opposition and manipulate electoral processes. This especially became evident with the application of these regulations. But I think, in my appreciation, I think the main way in which COVID-19 affected elections was through the first layer, which is that it created an environment where the population felt the pinch that came with the economy and led in many cases to shifts in the political landscape that I would later on expatiate on. So how did this play out with institutions? How institutions affected, I believe, depends on the vulnerability of these institutions before COVID. Situations where things got worse, I think the institutions were much more vulnerable. In situations where things got slightly better, I believe the environmental forces forced institutions to uphold democracy and the rule of law to an extent. So for EMBs, it affected them quite differently. There was greater pressure for transparency, of course. There was greater pressure for collaboration with government entities to come up with COVID-19 regulations, and sometimes that collaboration was misconceived, was misunderstood by the opposition. There was a need for greater transparency, consultation, inclusivity, and multi-sectoral collaboration. Several of these election management bodies indeed had challenges dealing with all these multiple layers of challenges. For the judiciary, it's not very obvious. The only case that comes to mind is Malawi, where during COVID, the courts actually requested that election be nullified, that election be nullified. And this was actually confirmed by the High Court later in the year, in April of 2020. So for security forces, issues that came up were around the unfair application of COVID regulations. For the best part, in countries that are semi-autocratic at least, the police especially was used to stifle the activities of the political opposition. The heads of state as an institution was also quite involved in most of those processes. The head of state, in most cases, would use his authority, abuse his authority, simply under the cover of COVID-19. And then the media became quite important, given restrictions. There were restrictions on freedom of association, movement, and assembly. And so the media became quite an important tool. But in most cases, we saw that state-owned media became an instrument for the ruling party to the exclusion of the political opposition. Obviously, the social media platforms became more popular for campaigning purposes. and of course, other alternative media platforms. For civil society, there was a challenge in getting funds because most donors began prioritizing health and safety programs over governance and election related programs. So for instance, in Zambia, the complaint was that donors were not providing money for civic and voter education. How did this affect political parties? In most cases, well, the opposition had challenges campaigning due to restrictions, but this did not stop parties from campaigning. They devised strategies to campaign, and by and large, political parties did not respect restrictions that were imposed by the government. There were huge rallies in most of the countries that held elections. And in fact, in some cases, when there was an effort to enforce the law, this was frowned upon by activists and civil society organizations. So what does the data actually say? I would run us through quickly on a number of indicators. First of all, turnout. How did COVID-19 affect turnout? There's juxtaposed a number of elections with their previous ones. So for Malawi, for instance, in 2014, when they held elections, turnout was 70%. The 2019 elections, which were later nullified by the courts, 74%. And then the election that was held in the heart of the pandemic in June of 2020 saw 64%, a slight decrease, I would say, from 70% if I compare it to the election that was held, genuine election that was held previously, writing off the 2019. As for Seychelles, there was actually an increase, a slight increase from the first round of elections. There were 2 rounds of elections. So the first round had 87%, the second round had 90% for 2015, but 2020 saw 88.45%. So not so much of a change in terms of turnout. Ghana actually saw an increase. 2016, 68%, 2020, 78.89%. For Burundi, there was a decrease from 73 to 64%. For Tanzania, there was a decrease, 67 to 50%. And for Zambia, there was indeed an increase, a significant increase, from 56.45 to 70.61. And then for Cape Verde, which held its elections recently, we saw an increase as well, a considerable increase from 35.47% to 47.97%. So on the basis of that, we can say that there is variation depending on the country, but in terms of turnout, we saw some cases where, turnout was actually high. I mean, that's probably explained by a number of other factors, but it shows that people were not necessarily so afraid of the pandemic, and the pandemic did not shape their participation to a large extent. Looking at some data from the International Ideas Global State of Democracy Indices, it is clear that election quality was not profoundly affected by the pandemic. So from 2019 to 2020, of course, the data is not up to date because elections held within 2021 are not yet reflected. But in 2020, this number of elections held on the continent. If you look at Africa, here, you see that there hasn't been a change from 2019 to 2020. It remained the same. It's a straight line almost. In terms of quality, we see a slight decline in Ghana. Obviously, the elections there were quite contested, including in the courts. We see an increase in the quality, an actual increase in Malawi. So within COVID, the quality actually increased. And then for Tanzania, there is a slight decline, which of course is explainable given the context. For Mali, it's indeed a straight line. In terms of freedom of association and assembly, for Ghana, it actually rose during that time. So there were no major restrictions. Even if they were, I think people still went about their business in a safe manner, or simply ignoring regulations, as they did in most cases. So it's mostly, if you see most of the countries, Burundi, Tanzania, and even Ethiopia. For Ethiopia, there was actually a slight increase there in terms of freedoms. Another issue, which, I looked at fundamental rights from 2020 to 2019 to 2020. Rights, it's a straight line, really. No major dips across the board. And then in terms of media integrity, it's also not particularly different from 2019 through to 2020. You see a slight decline here with Ethiopia. Of course, other country-specific determinants could explain that. Maybe it's as a result of the violence.
Koffi, Koffi, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks for reminding me.
Right.
So it's a straight line, even when it comes to freedom such as expression. So, what are the takeaways? Out of 15 presidential elections held, 5 on the continent led to political alternation, or an alternation of power from the opposition to from the ruling party to the opposition, which is 33%, and I believe that's significant. 33% is quite huge. During the pandemic, you saw a country like Niger, hold elections and had its first democratic transition, and by and large, the logistics were okay on election day, and procedures for voting were followed, even though in most cases, COVID-19 guidelines were not exactly followed. There is little evidence to suggest that COVID-19 substantially undermined the conduct of credible elections in Africa, in my view. If anything, the hypothesis I would advance is that, which of course needs further investigation, is that COVID-19 facilitated political transitions, especially in countries that have either free or partly free institutions. So the second part, which I'll just rush through quickly, looks at perceptions. These perceptions, as we are aware, predate COVID as well. The issues around election observation are twofold. One, which are contingent issues, which are practical operational issues that have to do with number of observers, how long they stay in a country, how familiar they are with the country, and so on. The number of days they stay in a country, how much spread they have in terms of coverage. And then there are other inherent challenges which are more difficult, which have to do with accusations of political bias, accusations of imperialism, accusations of election observation being a tool through which Western powers interfere in the elections of other countries. These latter ones are more difficult to address. So how did COVID-19 affect observation? COVID-19 affected international observation in a number of ways. The first one is that it reduced funding for international election observers due to shrinking donor economies. There were competing priorities, so people prioritize health and safety over donations for people to conduct election observation. So it shrank quite a bit. And then there were practical challenges which came with restrictions on travel. So international observers could not be deployed. And even when they were deployed, the numbers were quite reduced and coverage was quite little, and then which also affects the quality of the data and the representativeness. And another event which shaped perceptions was the absence of international observers in Malawi and Seychelles. This absence, in elections which went quite well, which led to peaceful transitions, then led people to start questioning the utility of election observation. How useful is election observation when things can happen without election observers being present? But I'll just mention a few pragmatic steps which were taken by international organizations within the context of COVID to remedy the situation. I think the first one is that they realized that it was important to begin working more intensively with civil society, domestic civil society organizations. So for instance, the Commonwealth provided funds to civil society organizations and capacity to help them in Seychelles to conduct citizen observation. Same as in Malawi, they did the same. They supported homegrown initiatives and provided capacity. And then in Zambia in 2021, the Commonwealth supported a Zambian-led and owned initiative, which was that of forming a coalition for peaceful elections, which brought together a number of strategic organizations which advocated for peaceful elections. This was done in collaboration with the United Nations. And then for organizations like the EU, they also developed strategies to cope with the situation. So they introduced hybrid observation where they deployed EU citizens within the country in combination with those that were brought from without. So what's the answer? I think the answer lies with reconceptualizing and restructuring international observation using COVID to change how a number of things are done in order to make observation more effective. So there is a need for greater coordination, greater cooperation, greater partnerships with domestic and other international observers. I think observation should focus more on processes and outcomes rather than focusing on events. There is rhetoric on that, but it has not really translated practically on the ground in terms of shaping methodologies to look at elections as processes. Just a few seconds more. Sorry, yep. Yeah, okay.
You on your last class?
Yes, just the last. I'm going through the last one. Yes. Sorry, I'm having some technical. Okay. Okay, this is the last. Yeah, the last one. So greater coordination and the introduction of methodologies that integrate citizen engagement. One of the problems we see with international observation is that it is looked upon as an elitist activity. So there is a need for us to see how we engage citizens of a country, because most people don't really know what international observers do. They don't know the contribution they bring to international observation. I'll give you a quick example to conclude, where in Zambia, for instance, you had leaders of the governing party who started criticizing the Commonwealth and accusing it of bias, when the Commonwealth Observer Group, had not even announced that it would be coming to Zambia to observe the elections. So this in itself tells you the perception issue. There are lots of things that could be done to help improve that perception and enhance citizens' understanding and participation in these processes. To end quite positively, many of you are aware of the positive role that is attributed to the Commonwealth, despite the criticism that was advanced by governing party officials when the Commonwealth had not even arrived on the ground, when the chief observer played a crucial role in facilitating a peaceful transition. Thank you very much. That's it for me now. For now, thank you. Over to you, Shishiwa.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we will go to Robert. We don't have much time. So Robert, it's all yours.
Yes, thanks very much, Shua, and thanks also to Matthias for doing all the organizing for today. I'm also grateful to Koffi for covering a lot of the political dynamics, which allows me to focus on the more technical aspects of making elections safer. Koffi, maybe you could stop sharing your slides now.
Okay.
My presentation today is going to be split roughly into three parts. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how well countries have done so far in mitigating the spread of COVID-19 during elections. Then I'll move on to the things that we can learn from this in terms of making elections more safe during this pandemic. And then finally, I'll talk about what can be done to prepare for similar situations in the future. Before getting into that, I think it would be good if I could briefly outline the research on which this presentation is based. I've been part of a research project called African Elections During the Covid-19 Pandemic, which was funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund and Newton Fund here in the UK. And it ran from August 2020 to August 2021. The project involved partners from the Centre of African Studies at the University of Edinburgh, where I'm based, and also the Open University of Tanzania, the Center for Democratic Development in Ghana, the Harvard Humanitarian Institute, and the NGO Shell, which is based in the Central African Republic. And what we were doing was following every stages of electoral processes in Tanzania, where the election day was in October 2020, in Ghana and the Central African Republic, where both of the election days were in December 2020. And we also followed a series of by-elections that took place in Kenya early this year. And this research involved nationally representative surveys of COVID-19 related attitudes and experience, observation of the electoral process, and qualitative interviews with government employees, political parties, civil society actors, and electoral management body staff. And during the project, we were looking at two main themes. The first of which was the way that the pandemic affected political participation. And Koffi's already said quite a lot about that. I can talk more about that during the Q&A if we have time. But I'm going to be focusing in today's presentation, as I said, on the second aspect of the project, which was if and how the risks of COVID-19 transmission have been mitigated during these elections. If you're interested in reading any of our country case studies, I'll just put a link to our project website in the chat there. There's one country case study for each of the 4 countries that I've mentioned. So moving on to this question of how well countries have done mitigating the spread of COVID-19 whilst holding elections. First of all, I think it's important to say something about why we should care about this issue, because it's actually quite difficult to say anything conclusive about the impact of elections on the spread of COVID-19. In part because in a lot of countries, the data in terms of number of cases isn't particularly reliable, but also because a number of variables are at play. So the precise impacts of elections can't really be isolated. So to give an example of this, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence of a spike in cases in Tanzania after the elections there. But it's difficult to say if that was because of what happened during the election, or if it was because of the Delta variant arriving in the country, or perhaps other factors. And it's even harder because at that time, the Tanzanian government weren't publicly releasing any statistics. So it's very challenging to know exactly how big an impact elections have. And I think there's also like a second argument here that in a lot of countries, including our case study countries, COVID-19 prevention measures in general have either been quite weak or inconsistently applied. And as Koffi alluded to, COVID-19 is not necessarily a huge priority for citizens in all of these countries. And this leads to the question, when citizens are not taking many precautions in their day-to-day lives, is strong protocols for elections something that we really need? And I would argue that the answer to this is yes, actually. When thinking about COVID-19 and how it's transmitted, there are a lot of reasons to believe that elections create risks of infection that go beyond those experienced in everyday life. And useful in informing this view was a study by the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, which, although it was looking at Ebola, is relevant here. And what they found is that during an electoral process, there's over 40 stages in which people gather or objects are exchanged. And many of these stages involve either large crowds or meetings between people who don't normally interact. In addition to that, for a variety of reasons, travel is quite common during elections in a number of African countries, as people leave the area they live most of the time to vote in another area. And this creates an additional threat of increasing the geographical spread of infections. So I do think this is an important issue to consider. So can elections be made safer then? Well, early in the pandemic, there were several sets of recommendations for conducting elections more safely, including one from IFES and another from a number of academics who were working on a British Academy project. And although a number of elections have been postponed or cancelled due to COVID-19, and IFES have a good record of this, by around the middle of 2020, we were in a situation where there was a better understanding of how the virus functioned and plenty of information to draw upon for holding elections more safely during the pandemic. So as a result, and as Koffi mentioned in his presentation, from late 2020 and throughout 2021, most elections have been taking place as scheduled. There have still been occasional attempts by governments to use COVID-19 as a reason for postponing elections. However, now that a lot of elections have taken place during COVID-19, these attempts don't look particularly credible and often lead to speculation that governments actually find the elections inconvenient for other reasons. So what did we see in our case study elections? Well, Tanzania was a bit of an outlier because at the time of the elections there, the government's official position was still there was no COVID-19 in Tanzania. So they put very few measures in place as a result of COVID-19. But in the other countries that we were looking at, the electoral management bodies did a very good job in producing sensible COVID-19 protocols. And these were based on measures which would, in theory, allow elections to take place in relative safety. And these are tended to be based on actually fairly simple concepts such as social distancing, wearing masks, washing hands, sanitizing surfaces, and electoral materials. We've also seen evidence of some voters complying with some of these protocols. And you'll notice that I qualified that sentence twice because not all of the protocols were well applied in practice. And there were also a few risks that were overlooked entirely. But I think one of our major takeaways was that most of the shortcomings in terms of the safety at the elections that we observed related to poor enforcement of measures that were in place. So, for example, people not social distancing when they were supposed to, people not bothering to sanitize communal items in polling stations, people not wearing masks or not wearing masks properly, things like that. I would also add to this that compliance was particularly low, often during activities in which the political parties were interacting with voters. So, for example, campaign rallies and meetings. Koffi already spoke about the fact that there were problems getting political parties to buy into some of the measures. So, how can this be improved? We've created, the project has created a set of recommendations for how the elections can be safer. They can also be found using that link to our project website in the chat. Now, our recommendations differ from the sets of recommendations that I've mentioned that came out early in the pandemic for two major reasons. So firstly, the other recommendations, because they were created very, very early in the pandemic, were therefore unable to draw heavily on evidence from elections which actually took place during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in contrast, ours have the advantage of being able to be based on the elections in our case study countries. And secondly, the earlier recommendations were generally designed to cover all types of elections in all countries at once. And therefore, they weren't always sensitive to the particular challenges facing low and middle income countries. So just to give a quick example of this, a recommendation that postal voting should be relied on more heavily isn't really appropriate in places where there's not a reliable postal service. Ours, insofar as these things can be generalized, are more sensitive to the conditions in which elections in Africa are likely to take place. And the first thing that we looked at was how COVID-19 protocols for elections are created. And in order for compliance to be high, we recommend that these protocols are based on technical rather than political considerations. If there's a perception that they're being used instrumentally, you're less likely to get buy-in. Ideally, they would be the result of a consultative process, which involved parties from across the political spectrum, so as to get as much buy-in as possible. The COVID-19 protocols, and this is a key point, also need to make it clear who is responsible for enforcing them and what the consequences will be for non-compliance. And it's important that they be applied evenly regardless of political affiliation. In the recommendations, we also note that electoral management staff are extremely busy with their regular work at the time of elections. And this has meant that often their focus on reducing the spread of COVID-19 has been quite limited, at times even an afterthought. What we recommend is that a specific point person be put in place, perhaps an additional commissioner with a public health background, and they could be tasked with ensuring that COVID-19 protocols are considered and followed at each stage of the election. Then at the local level, we suggest that a member of polling station staff, and you wouldn't necessarily need a new person here, this could be an additional role for the person who's already the entry or queuing clerk. They should be designated as a COVID-19 protocols clerk to place more emphasis on compliance to protocols at polling stations. We do note that this task probably should not be done by security staff whose primary role should remain maintaining peace in and around polling stations. Another point that we pick up on is that voter education and engagement need to be updated to better incorporate COVID-19 mitigation measures. What we've found so far is that the advice on voting has gone out as it did before, and then the additional steps related to COVID-19 have gone out separately, rather than having these two things integrated. So putting them together would be a good idea, including on things like the voting procedure illustrations that you find at polling stations, which have not always been updated. A final point that we make is that a balance must be struck between the need to protect competitive elections and the need to halt the spread of the pandemic. And in many African countries, poorly financed opposition parties, as Koffi was talking about this a bit, they don't always have equal coverage in the media. They end up being reliant to a very great extent on rallies, meetings, door-to-door canvassing in order to get their message out at the time of elections. So banning these forms of campaigning completely would actually be quite harmful to the competitiveness of the elections. And in fact, it probably would create an incentive for politicians to ignore protocols completely. What we suggest as a better solution is to put measures in place to ensure that this kind of campaigning can occur more safely. So it's things like holding rallies outside, making sure there's some social distancing, asking people to wear masks at them. Things like that are perhaps better than cancelling them completely. This brings us on to the final topic, which is how can we prepare for similar situations in the future? And we need to think about this because epidemics are part of human history. They recur periodically. And in fact, scientists argue that viral outbreaks are likely to be more common in the future due to environmental damage. Preparing now for future pandemics also has the benefit that it will involve the same steps that we need to do to prepare for viral outbreaks at the regional, national, and subnational levels. There are a number of things that you won't be able to decide in advance, and the response will depend on the exact nature of the health crisis being faced. A lot of the considerations then will be similar to ones that I've just talked about in terms of our COVID recommendations. So I would just move on to talking about the steps that have to be considered now in advance of a health crisis. Electoral laws need to be updated to better cover all contingencies relating to pandemics and other emergencies, because viral outbreaks force basic decisions to be made, such as whether to cancel or postpone elections in situations where public health may be at risk. And as with the example of ECOWAS and Koffi's presentation, current legislation simply is not always flexible to allow for the most appropriate decisions to be made. So constitutions, specific electoral laws, codes of conduct, and electoral management bodies operating guides all need to be updated to make sure they allow for delays to the end of government mandates, for the creation of interim governments during extension periods. And this is important because if provisions related to health emergencies are not in place before the crisis is underway, there may be undesirable delays in decision-making, electoral arrangements can be made without legal basis, the process may be rushed and not subject to adequate scrutiny, there's more potential for manipulation and undesired consequences. Another issue that's important to think about in advance is funding for the elections that take place during health crises. The measures are designed to reduce viral transmission do come at a financial cost. Higher income countries are better placed to absorb these than low income countries. So this creates a need to provide additional budgetary support for the effective administration of elections. This could come in the form of emergency support from the donor community, which could be put in place in advance so it doesn't have to be arranged at the last minute, ring-fenced and only released in situations where elections were taking place in unusually challenging circumstances. And the idea is based partly on a suggestion by Tanya Holstein of Westminster Foundation for Democracy. There are a few other things that should be considered now. Shifts towards electronic voting might work in some countries. In other countries, limiting the number of people who travel during elections would also be a good idea. But because I want to leave some time for questions, I won't say very much about them. I will, however, get in a final plug for our briefing paper on future pandemics that I wrote with Tom Maloney, which again can be found on our project website, and it goes into these issues in greater detail. Okay, back to you, Shishua.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you to both of you for what I thought were illuminating presentations. We don't have much time, but before I abuse my role as chair, we'll go straight to the audience. If there are any questions, please do raise your hand or do type your question in the chat box, and you could ask any of the two presenters, or add your comments on what they have suggested. So anyone from the audience?
I think I see one there from Chris Day. He has his hand up.
That's right. Chris, go for it.
Hi, Koffi. Hi, Robert. Really great to hear your presentations. Koffi, I was interested in your point, one of your graphs about clean elections and the quality not dropping so much. It looked like the elections that were of higher quality to start with, so Tanzania and I think Ghana's both dipped slightly. So I wonder whether there are any learning points about the quality of elections in countries where standards are already pretty high, and how sort of COVID might tempt people to cut corners, or why are we seeing that decline? And vaguely linked to that, South Africa has local elections coming up in 1st of November. Do either of you have thoughts, or anybody have thoughts about how well the South African Election Commission is preparing, and how much I guess is public expectation of a good process part of getting this right? I'll stop there. And great to see you as well, Sishwa.
Thank you so much, Chris. We have any other question before the panelists respond to that? So there's a question in the chat room, and it says, how ready are African countries for electronic voting? Which country would be most likely to implement this at national scale? I think this is for both of you. And since there are no other questions, I'll let both of you respond, starting with Robert.
Yeah, so in terms of the elections that took a dip in quality, or the countries where political freedoms dipped during COVID-19, we can't necessarily say that that was because of COVID-19. So, for example, in the case of Tanzania, there was a process in decline of democratic freedoms that began in 2015 with the incoming Magufuli administration. And one of the reasons that turnout was so poor was because everybody knew the outcome of the election in advance. We actually have survey data that shows that people in Tanzania weren't particularly concerned about voting as a result of COVID-19, nor was COVID-19 used explicitly as a means for preventing people from voting or participating politically, although that there were other things in place in order to do that. In terms of how well South Africa are doing, as far as I'm aware, they've done a very good job in thinking about this issue well in advance. They were looking into it very early. They were trying to get things organized. But the real test will be to see whether the measures they put in place are actually observed in practice, as I've said before. So I'm not overly familiar with the exact details at the moment, but hopefully that is an issue that they've been considering. In terms of electronic voting, there are a few places where some electronic elements in the voting system have begun to be introduced. And this doesn't always go well because trust in the system can be quite low. It can be viewed as being a black box. So any move towards introducing more electronic voting would, electronic voting in addition to the kind of electronic counting and tallying that we have at the moment, would have to be done very, very cautiously. And it is quite difficult to suggest a country where it could be put in place right now. There's also financing issues, and whether spending money on that is a priority. Koffi, maybe you have other ideas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert. I think you have been quite comprehensive in your responses. Perhaps just to add that in relation to the question around South Africa's preparation, I think the country relatively has robust institutions, electoral institutions. So you would believe that it would do a better job at managing some of these processes in the context of COVID. And also, of course, there's better healthcare in South Africa. But the challenge lies, as Robert highlighted, in seeing whether the population really respects these protocols and how practical these measures actually are in terms of the voting exercise itself. Because conceptually, some of these things are nice and easy, but issues around queue management on election day, managing thousands of people, are a different ballgame altogether. Practically, social distancing in queues is quite an uphill task, as we saw in several countries that have held elections. On electronic voting, it is a very, very interesting question. I am particularly not a great fan of electoral voting. I believe more in trust in electoral systems. The UK doesn't have an electoral voting, system, but there's absolute trust in the elections. Elections have, there are countries where you've actually seen reversals where electronic voting was adopted and then they reversed back to manual voting because there was no trust in, as Robert put it, the black box, somebody, punching something and that thing recording his vote without him actually seeing it is something that people do not necessarily trust in many countries. We saw a reversal in Botswana where the opposition actually challenged that in court and successfully did so. The court ruled that these voting machines should not be used in general elections. And we saw the same uproar in Namibia, where they were first introduced on the continent. And so I think thought needs to be put into these things before adopted. There's usually a rush in embracing technology without having full consideration of the challenges that come with such technology. So I think the answer is in building trust in our electoral processes rather than investing in technology.
Thank you. Thank you. If you can briefly, each of you respond to Tafawa's question. To what extent was increasing voter turnout a reaction to the perceived undemocratic undertakings in response to COVID? Did COVID-19 in other ways drive high voter turnout in the elections that took place during the pandemic? Any brief comments from each of you?
I'm happy to comment on that. I think one of the interesting things that I found about elections during the pandemic is that the pandemic hasn't always been the biggest political issue considered during the time of these elections. A lot of the time, people are worried about basic democratic freedoms. They're worried about having somebody in power that can run their country in a sensible way. And there's a number of other health problems, issues relating to conflict that affect specific African countries that people also focus on. And we had, during our research project, we were asking people if they were concerned about voting due to COVID, and the answer was almost always no. So there's not much evidence that COVID prevented people from going to vote. But also when we were asking questions like, what's the most important political issue for you? They weren't saying COVID. When we were asking which are the health concerns that people are most concerned about in your area, very, very few people were saying COVID. So from somebody in my positions where everything in the UK has been about COVID for 18 months, it was a little bit surprising, but it's something that we should bear in mind, that COVID's not necessarily going to be the biggest issue during elections. There were a lot of warnings about how COVID might be used instrumentally to help incumbents. And we've seen evidence of that in places like Uganda and to a certain extent in Zambia. But also in a lot of other countries, we just haven't. It just hasn't been attempted, even in places where other manipulations are certainly taking place. So I think that my overall point here is just don't overestimate the extent to which COVID is going to be central to everything during elections.
Thank you. Koffi, do you want to add anything?
Yes, indeed. Robert has provided a nice response. But in addition to that, I'll put a spin, which is that it's anecdotal, of course. It's that COVID-19 may have put some wind in the sails of opposition political parties. It may have put some wind in the sails of young people whose livelihoods have been, completely destroyed by the pandemic, and in some cases how it was managed. And this was possibly something that provided for mobilization, mass mobilization. We saw that in Zambia, where the population mobilized itself and came out in very huge numbers. I think the pinch created by the COVID-19 downturn in the economy may have contributed to an extent to that level of mobilization and turnout.
Yeah, I completely agree that the economic impacts have created some political energy in certain states, especially those that were already struggling to a certain extent before the pandemic began.
Thank you. Robert and Koffi, thank you so much for illuminating insights on this topic. I have no doubt that the audience is leaving the discussion with a better understanding of how COVID-19 is actually good, perhaps, for turnovers in Africa. Maybe we need the pandemic to last more if we have to see changes across the continent. So thank you so much for making the time to share your research findings with us. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. And I can see a round of applause from the audience. It shows how much they enjoyed the discussion. Be on the lookout for our next talking point or topic next month. We often meet every third Tuesday of each month, and check your emails constantly. You'll find another fascinating topic to keep you informed. We will be sending out the email in the next couple of days. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sishiwa. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thanks everybody for your attention. Thank you.